Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek. And a while back, I did a video on the Scouring of the Shire, which is a chapter in The Lord of the Rings that doesn't really get into the movies. So if you haven't read the book, or if you're not familiar with this chapter of the book, you may want to go watch that video before you watch this one. But I mentioned in that video, and I will link to that in the description below, by the way, I mentioned in that video how the Scouring of the Shire really does kind of complete the story arcs of the various hobbits, and that's one of the reasons the chapter is so important. So I wanted to go in detail in this video to kind of look at their different story arcs, because it's not super obvious how that works. I think I kind of explained it a little bit there, but I think a little more detailed look will help us really explain why the Scouring of the Shire really does capstone the various story arcs of the four hobbits. So let's take a look at that. First, let's look at Merry and Pippin. Merry and Pippin, of course, are Pippin is the youngest member of the group. Merry, I think, is slightly older than Sam. But their story arcs are very similar. They take very parallel paths, but they're not quite the same. Pippin begins as, he's not even of age. He's 29, and coming of age for hobbits comes at the age of 33. So he is very much the most irresponsible member of the entire group. And you can see this in a lot of ways. When the hobbits first set out, Pippin will, kind of joke about things a lot, and he'll try to put tasks off on Sam, because Sam is he's the lower class servant member of the group, whereas Pippin is, to the extent that hobbits have an aristocracy, he's certainly a member of it, because he's the son of the Took, who is the Thane of the Shire, who is kind of the substitute king. I mean, there's a lot of history that goes into the Thane of the Shire and all this, but the idea is at one time, of course, there was a king in Arnor who the hobbits acknowledged as king of their own land. The king eventually dies and leaves, he leaves an heir, but the kingdom itself falls apart, so there's no real king anymore, and the Thane of the Shire becomes kind of the de facto head of the Shire in place of the king, and that eventually becomes a hereditary title for the Took family. So anyway, Pippin is, he's the next in line for the Thane title, but he's a really young guy, and he's very irresponsible, puts off a lot of things on Sam, tries to get him to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But not even just that. One of the things that you will see about Pippin is he does a lot of just really stupid stuff. So example, unlike in the movie where he turns an arrow in a or dwarf skeleton, in the book he just is at the well at the in Moria. He literally just tosses a rock in because he just wants to see how long it'll take to hit the bottom. Really stupid idea, right? And so in that instance, just like in the movie, Gandalf is quite right to call him the Fool of the Took. But you'll also see, for example, that later on in the story, he doesn't spend, this doesn't get referenced at the time, but later on it'll get referenced that Pippin spent virtually no time in Rivendell learning about anything that they were going to be doing, looking at maps or anything like that. He basically doesn't spend any of his time being a responsible member of the group. But he begins an upward trend after the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, because once Merry and Pippin are captured by the Uruk-hai, and I'm going to eventually do a video on this episode too, because the differences between the book and the movie here are very interesting. But in this episode, Pippin really kind of starts to grow up, because after they're captured, there is a point where Pippin gets the idea, well, he doesn't get the idea so much, he has a very brief opportunity, because of one of the orcs gets killed. He manages to cut his own, the ropes around his hands, and then he ties them back together in a really loose way to make it look like he's still tied up, but he can actually get out really easily before anybody notices. And so he's setting up for future escape. And of course, this is where he really starts to, get a little more of an active role in the story. And the next thing, of course, is he'll end up running off and dropping the brooch from his the elven brooch from Lorien onto the floor, the ground, so that Aragorn and whoever's following can, hopefully follow their trail. So he's really starting to pick up on, taking responsibility and whatnot. That said, he still ends up doing a lot of stupid stuff, like looking into the Palantir, uh, and, causing trouble that way. So, I mean, it's not like he's totally grown up yet. But then after that, Gandalf takes him to Minas Tirith, and he continues his growing up process. And what part of that is he pledges his service to Denethor in memory of Boromir, who saved his life. And, again, book versus movie, there's a lot of stuff you could explore here too, but it's not quite like in the movie. In the book, you really get the sense that even Gandalf is, really okay with this. And you have to, you have to wonder if Gandalf is partially okay with this because it's going to help Pippin grow up. And you can see in a lot of the interactions that Pippin has after this point, he is starting to become a lot more mature. Uh, Having to deal with Denethor, who is a very stern, severe type of guy, um, it's a lot harder for him to just be a goofball and whatnot. And so that really kind of starts to make him grow up a bit. He never loses, of course, his, childlike innocence in a lot of ways. And even after all these events happen, he's still a very, happy personality, and that doesn't go away. But you can tell he's growing up there. And he also has to take a lot of responsibility because when Denethor begins to really go downhill and he's about to burn Faramir, Pippin has to take the responsibility on his own because nobody else will do it, of doing whatever he can to stop this and to warn Gandalf so that Gandalf can come and save Faramir. So he's really becoming a much more active participant in the events, and doing a lot of things like that. And eventually he, and not Merry, unlike in the book, unlike in the movie rather, will end up being the one to go to the gates of Mordor with the armies of Gondor and Rohan, because Merry is wounded by the, well, not wounded, but he's, because of his stabbing the Witch King, he is basically kind of overcome with the evil of all that. He's got the Black Breath, and so Merry is not good and well enough to go off to battle, so Pippin is the only one who does, and basically to represent hobbits as well as all the other races. So, I mean, over the course of time, he's, growing up and becoming a much more mature, responsible person. And at the end, of course, he ends up doing similar things in the Scouring of the Shire. By the time you get to that point, he and Merry are kind of the two leaders as far as the action of it. Frodo is still kind of the one who's calling the shots, but Merry and Pippin are definitely the more martial leaders, let's say. Merry more so than Pippin, but Pippin definitely does his part. When it comes to the point where they think they're going to have a final confrontation with, all the men who are in the Scouring, I mean in the Shire, he rides off to Tookland, rounds up all the Tooks he can find to come help out with, the battle that is inevitably going to ensue. Merry is doing a lot of the more leadership role, but, well, let's talk about Merry now because that's kind of where we're at. Merry, despite being young, but not quite as young as Pippin, in fact, if I remember correctly, he's like 36 at the time of the events of the story. Frodo would be 51. I think Sam is about 35, so he and Merry are pretty close. Merry is also very much kind of part of the aristocracy because he's kind of the heir to the Brandybuck line, and Brandybucks are very, kind of high up in social standing as well, although a lot of them are seen as kind of, as are the Tooks, as kind of weird because they're more adventurous than your standard hobbit. But Merry, he is much more mature from the get-go. And we see this in a lot of ways. Early on, what we see is that he seems to be the leader of the conspiracy, which is the idea that Merry and Pippin and Sam is kind of their secondhand spy, sort of. They are the ones who are kind of keeping an eye on Frodo, realizing something's going on. You get the idea that Merry is the one who's kind of heading all that up, and that makes sense because Merry tells everybody that he saw once upon a time Bilbo use the ring, and so ever since then he's been watching. So you get the idea pretty early that Merry has got his eyes open. He's, really looking out for things, trying to, make sure things are taken care of. And, we see that process, especially if we compare it in parallel to Pippin's. He's got this kind of all the way through. unlike Pippin, who in Rivendell basically did nothing productive, Merry spent some time looking at maps and things like that. And so whenever they finally escape the Uruk-hai, he knows they're in Fangorn. And, he basically points this out to Pippin. It's like, if you had known, if you had been paying any attention at Rivendell and spending your time well, you would know where we are. We're in Fangorn. And so it's my turn to take up leadership because now you don't know where you are, and I kind of do. Not that he really knows a whole lot, but, to the extent that either of them is going to be better suited to lead at that point, it's Merry. After, of course, the events of the Palantir and they get separated, Merry ends up in Rohan as opposed to Gondor, where Pippin ends up. And we see this is a video in and of itself, the parallels between Merry in Rohan and Pippin in Gondor. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff there, but Merry in Rohan, the theme of his story is he doesn't want to be left behind like baggage. He doesn't want to be left behind by Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas. He doesn't want to be left behind by Theoden and the Riders. He just doesn't want to be left behind. He wants to be part of it. And you can kind of see that as an aspect of his prior story arc, because up to this point, he's had a fairly significant role, even though a lot of it is kind of background. We learn about things after the fact. But he's had a very significant role in getting things to where they are now. After they leave Rivendell, obviously Gandalf and Aragorn are the leaders, and most everybody else is just kind of following along. But prior to that point, and after the Uruk-hai affair, he's been kind of a leader, and so he doesn't like the idea of just being sat down on the sidelines and doing nothing. In the end, of course, he does end up going along with the Riders with a disguised Éowyn, and he'll eventually kind of realize, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. What am I supposed to do here? Which is ironic because this whole time he's been wanting to go, and then he ends up kind of questioning that, and yet he plays a crucial part in the Battle of Éowyn against the Witch King because he, hits the Witch King from behind and allows Éowyn to actually kill him. So he ends up doing something very important once again. And so Pippin is actually kind of trying to make up for, points by going to the Black Gate. But at any rate, Merry's kind of storyline will end up wrapping up in the Scouring of the Shire, where he is still kind of the main leader, where he's the one who's really kind of ordering things, and I don't mean ordering in a commanding sense, but like making things orderly. He's kind of making the battle strategies, and he's taking a lot of the lead role. Frodo, like I said, is calling most of the shots, but Merry is the one who kind of takes the actions. He's the one who does a lot of the here's how we're going to go about this. He's almost like Frodo's herald, you might say, except more of a combative herald than just a spokesperson. But he does a lot of the talking and a lot of the acting in terms of getting things going in the Scouring. So that's kind of how Merry's storyline ends up and how it works out. And you really have to look at it in parallel to Pippin's. So that's pretty interesting too. Now let's look at Frodo and Sam. Sam, of course, begins the story, as I mentioned earlier, he's a spy for Merry and Pippin, but he basically begins the story not only acting as their agent, but also the servant of Frodo. He's Frodo's gardener. He starts out with very little in the way of agency in that sense, because he's kind of just following along, helping out. And you can see that a lot. I mean, he's constantly in the early parts of the story being the guy who's just trying to be helpful, carry more stuff, do more work. That's really his role. But over the course of the story, you start to see him acting more and more independently. And, you can get a lot of examples of this, but if you want, I can link to a video below that I did on who's the true hero, Frodo or Sam. And in there, I go through a lot of detail of the various ways in which Sam over time starts to become more and more active on his own. So for, an early example of this, whenever Frodo kind of disappears after Boromir, messes with him and everybody splits up trying to look for him, Aragorn eventually at first is going along with Sam, and he runs off, and Sam's like, I can't keep up with this guy, so let me just think. And he starts to think, and he realizes, well, Frodo's got to get back to the boat, so he goes back to the boats. And here he really asserts himself for the first time too, because he really pushes the idea on Frodo, you're not leaving me, you know? This was always kind of a theme that he was always going to be with Frodo, but this is the first time where he really kind of bucks up, and even though Frodo is telling him, no, you can't, Sam's like, no, I'm going. You can't tell me not to. So he starts to take a more active role here. And of course, as I detailed in that other video, over time, you can see him being a little more willing to speak his own mind, especially when it comes to the issue of Gollum. He becomes more active too in the relationships with Frodo and Faramir. And then finally, of course, in Mordor itself, Frodo is not incapacitated, but he's, very much to the point where he's not capable of doing much on his own. And at that point, Sam really has to kind of act for both of them. And so we can see all that. And this whole thing is kind of a process of becoming his own man. And it culminates in two ways. I mean, at the Field of Cormallen, he is recognized along with Frodo as one of the two great heroes. And in that sense, his story arc kind of culminates there. But in the Scouring of the Shire, what we see is, him becoming his own man and it's not even just the Scouring of the Shire, it kind of goes beyond that. But in the Scouring and the immediate aftermath, we see that Sam, kind of acts kind of independently in a lot of ways, talking with some of the other hobbits and whatnot. But the Scouring is the first time we really get a good indication of his relationship with Rosie Cotton. And it's only now that we really get the love interest aspect of his story. And that seems weird that we would only really learn about this at the very end. I mean, we kind of, I think, get a couple of references to it earlier, but this is really where it all comes out. And so it seems weird, but you have to look at it from the perspective of his story arc. He's not his own man until now. And so it's now that he's kind of his own independent person that he finally has what it takes to really make a move and, go after Rosie. You get the impression that Rosie was kind of waiting for this the whole time in some of their conversations, which are kind of humorous. But this is where he really steps up and becomes his own person. He does end up marrying Rosie. And then, after the Scouring, Frodo, of course, hands off the responsibility of finishing the book to Sam, and he gives Bag End to Sam. And so that kind of caps it off just a little bit more. But ultimately, Sam's story arc is about becoming more than just a servant. It's about becoming, his own man in both his own master and also just his own, he's going to have his own ideas. He's going to have his own motivations. He's not just going to be Frodo's sidekick. That's basically his story arc and how it wraps up. Now, finally, let's look at Frodo. Frodo's story arc is complicated. Let's just put it that way. It's not complicated. It's just very subtle, because Frodo is, in one sense, seems like the one person who doesn't have much of a story arc. Because at the beginning of the story, not in the movie so much, but in the beginning of the book, he's not a very weak character. I mean, he's definitely got, everything going for him. He's wiser than most hobbits. He's more knowledgeable than most hobbits. He's more adventurous than most hobbits, although still not that adventurous. And so it doesn't seem like he does really a lot in the course of the story to grow or become a different person. But there are some ways in which he does. And one of those is, he kind of learns from his hardships about ways that, the world is not quite what he thought it was. And so, early on in the story, we can see Frodo having, glimpses of longing to either go after Bilbo or just go on his own adventure. But he's really not ready for it. And it's only the, Gandalf bringing the story of the ring and all of its evil that really pushes Frodo to be like, okay, well, I have to go now. And at that point, he also realizes, I'd rather not. He likes the idea of adventure, but he also does get kind of a sense of, well, I'm going to go look for Bilbo then. So there's, competing things going on in him. He kind of wants adventure, but he kind of doesn't. And there's also an aspect here, if you read the book and not just watch the movie, when he comes to this decision, he tells Gandalf, there are times that I've thought that the Shire and its inhabitants are just stupid, and maybe an invasion of dragons would do them some good. But now I don't see it that way. Now I like the idea of it being a peaceful, foothold that is here. So even if I never come back here, the fact that it will be here safe and sound will help me, psychologically on my journey, basically, is what he says. And here is kind of the beginning of his story arc, because it is kind of his growth in this kind of wisdom, I think, that characterizes him. He's always been a little bit smarter and wiser than the other hobbits. He's older, for one thing. He's about 51 when the story really gets kicked off. But over time, he grows in other kinds of wisdom he didn't have before. So he starts to learn, the wisdom of humility, ultimately, I think, is what his story arc is. He learns through the process of carrying this burden and all the other things he goes through, being stabbed on Weathertop and all this, that things are not quite as easy as it might seem from Bilbo's adventure, being told that from a young age. He realizes that, he kind of comes to realize basically that, he is just a small piece in a big, big game, essentially, that's being played, and he's just an instrument of providence. That's part of his story arc. And it's really hard to put your finger on things, but for instance, when he goes, when he gets into Mordor, he's, kind of almost inert as a character. He's not being very active. And Sam has to do a lot of the work for him, but he is, he's allowing Sam to do as much as he can. He basically says, I've got no hope left. I've got no, strength left, but if you can keep going, I will go with you. And you could see part of that as being his learning process of, I can't do everything. I can't be the one to do all the different things. And the really big kicker for that really comes at the end, where he is incapable of throwing the ring into the fire, and Gollum basically has to do it for him by accident. And again, movie not like book here. In the book, in case you don't know, after Gollum bites the ring off Frodo's finger, he just basically is so elated at getting the ring back, he dances around until he just slips off the edge. And Frodo basically says to Sam, if it weren't for Gollum, the quest would have failed. So here again, we get a reference to the idea that Frodo is, kind of not the sole actor in his own story. And this kind of goes back to another issue that I think is really important in his story arc, because it points back to a lot of the history of Gollum and the Baggins family. Because one of the things that Gandalf tells Frodo, of course, is that pity stayed Bilbo's hand, and the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many. And when Frodo sees him, he says, now that I see him, I do pity him. And so he doesn't just kill him or leave him tied up or anything like that. And so he learns the value of pity, and, to the extent that it has any role. And the pity also plays into his relationship with Saruman, too, because Saruman, who is the one who causes the ruin of the Shire, Frodo, has pity on him. And that's not why he doesn't kill him. He doesn't kill Saruman because he basically says he's a member of a high order that we don't have any business touching. That's the reason he doesn't kill him. But he does express the fact that he has pity for Saruman. And so you can see in that act, and in his, relationship to Saruman in that way, that he has learned over time the value of pity and what it can accomplish, because Gandalf tells him way earlier on, not only that the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, but Gollum has some part to play, for good or ill. And so at the end of the story, we can see that Frodo has now kind of learned both the humility, in the sense that he has kind of realized that the adventure is not his, and that, it's not really his to own, but he also has learned that, pity and mercy are very valuable things. He carries that lesson all the way through the Scouring of the Shire, and he's trying to prevent anybody from being killed because he's trying to show pity and mercy. And, even though it doesn't work out because some of the men just have to be killed because of the way they attack the hobbits, you can tell he's wanting to avoid bloodshed as much as possible. And that actually kind of goes back to another comment he makes to Sam and Frodo. He says, "It won't be my part to strike a blow ever again." Uh, and, this idea that he's really just kind of given up on the idea of taking that kind of action. And so in the Scouring, Frodo in some ways seems inert, because mostly what he's doing is saying we don't want to kill anybody, and Merry and Pippin are the ones that are really taking the lead in the action. But Frodo is really kind of being the leader in the sense that he's telling the different hobbits, we're not going to do these things. This is off limits. And so he is very much still the leader in that sense. And it took me several reads to finally pick up on that, because it's like I said, it's nuanced, and it's really hard to put your finger on Frodo's story, but I think this is really kind of the way in which the Scouring caps off his story arc. So those are my thoughts on how the various story arcs of the Hobbits cap off in the Scouring of the Shire chapter. If you got some additional thoughts, I'd love to hear them, because especially on Frodo, because like I say, some of his story is hard to really trace the arc. Because it's so subtle and nuanced, unlike the others, which are a little bit more straightforward. So do leave some comments below. Feel free to critique me, because I'm not 100% sold on all these ideas either. So that'll be an interesting discussion. Other than that, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore if you want to get some occasional Tolkien trivia questions. Please do like and share the video, and if you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that over here. Don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support the channel over here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.